My name is Nina and I am 33 years old. 8 years ago, my sister Vanessa stole my fiancé Cameron just weeks before our wedding. She convinced him that he had immense potential and needed a high society wife, not a basic struggling data analyst like me. Today, at their extravagant 8th anniversary vow renewal, she aggressively shoved a $12,000 catering bill against my chest and ordered me to make myself useful. I did not scream or cry. I calmly pulled out an invitation-only Obsidian credit card and paid it in full, leaving her entirely speechless. What she did not know was that the multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm her failing husband was currently begging for a bailout was actually my company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. The Oak Ridge Country Club was suffocatingly lavish. Blinding flashbulbs illuminated the grand foyer where a massive ice sculpture of two swans slowly melted onto a bed of imported roses. Vanessa was wearing a custom designer gown that easily cost more than my first car. She glided through the room with a practiced smile, soaking up the attention of the local elite. Cameron stood near the bar, schmoozing with local investors and trying to project an image of immense wealth and untouchable success. I knew it was all a facade. His boutique investment firm was secretly drowning in toxic debt. I knew this because I tracked market failures for a living, and his firm was blinking red on every financial radar in the city. I was standing near the champagne fountain, keeping to myself, when Vanessa marched over. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, a sound I had learned to dread since childhood. Without a single word of greeting, she aggressively shoved a thick linen paper invoice against my chest. I caught it before it could fall to the floor. It was the final bill for the floral arrangements and the premium catering. The total was exactly $12,000. "Make yourself useful, Nina," she snapped, her voice intentionally loud enough for several passing guests to hear. "You are single, childless, and stuck in that dead-end data job. The least you can do is cover the shortfall as a thank you for being allowed to attend such an exclusive event." "I am not paying for your party, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I handed the invoice back to her, but she refused to take it. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume overwhelming my senses. Her voice dripped with pure venom. "Do not be bitter, just because Cameron realized I was the one with the actual future," she whispered, maliciously. "He needed a high society wife to build his empire, not some basic girl crunching numbers in a cubicle. Pay the bill, Nina. Consider it a tax for standing in the presence of real success." "Real success?" I asked, maintaining my composure. "You mean seducing my fiancé a month before our wedding because you convinced him your social connections would make him a millionaire? That is not success, Vanessa. That is theft." "What is going on here?" My mother, Patricia, materialized beside us, her face pinched with harsh disapproval. My father, Richard, was right behind her, holding a glass of scotch. "Nina, why are you causing a scene in front of Cameron's important investors?" "I am not causing a scene, Mom," I replied. "Vanessa just handed me a $12,000 bill for her own vow renewal and demanded I pay it." Instead of scolding her golden child, my mother turned her fierce glare entirely on me. "Well, you should pay it, Nina. Your sister and Cameron are on the verge of a massive corporate breakthrough. They have appearances to maintain in this society. You have absolutely no expenses. You have no husband and no children and no real responsibilities. Empty your savings and support your sister for once in your life, instead of being so selfishly resentful." "Your mother is right, Nina," my father added, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Cameron is pitching to the biggest venture capital firm in the city next week. They need this night to look absolutely flawless. Stop being difficult and be a team player for your family." The phrase team player echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. In this family, being a team player always meant sacrificing my own happiness to pave the way for Vanessa. When we were teenagers, my parents used my college fund to pay for her modeling portfolio because she was the one destined for greatness. When I graduated at the top of my university class, they skipped my ceremony to help her move into an apartment with a man she dumped 3 months later. And when she decided she wanted the man I was supposed to marry, they told me to gracefully step aside because Cameron belonged in a world I could not comprehend. They had trained me to accept their cruelty as a normal family dynamic. But the woman standing before them tonight was no longer their obedient scapegoat. I looked at the three of them. My mother with her condescending scowl, always ready to defend her favorite daughter. My father with his dismissive arrogance, always viewing me as a financial burden. And Vanessa wearing a smirk of absolute triumph, fully expecting me to either run away in tears or empty my meager checking account to appease their demands. They truly believed I was the exact same broken 25-year-old girl they had discarded 8 years ago when Cameron walked out on me. They had no idea I had spent every single day of those 8 years building an empire in the shadows. I did not argue with them. I did not waste my breath defending my career or my life choices. I simply opened my evening clutch. "If you are that desperate for cash, Vanessa, I will handle it," I said. I signaled the catering manager who had been hovering nervously a few feet away. He rushed over with a portable payment terminal, looking incredibly uncomfortable with the family dispute. I pulled out my card. It was not a standard bank card. It was a solid Obsidian Centurion card, issued by invitation only to individuals with extraordinary net worth. The heavy metal clinked distinctly against the screen of the terminal. The catering manager's eyes widened drastically as the $12,000 charge was approved in less than a second. I handed the long receipt directly to Vanessa, whose arrogant smirk had completely vanished. It was rapidly replaced by profound confusion as she stared at the heavy black card in my hand. "Enjoy your party," I said smoothly, looking her dead in the eye. "I hope the investment was worth it." I turned and walked out of the country club, leaving my parents and my sister standing in completely stunned silence amidst their fake luxury. I did not look back. I felt a tremendous sense of liberation as I handed my valet ticket to the attendant outside. For years I had allowed their words to make me feel small. But tonight their insults sounded like nothing more than the desperate gasps of people drowning in their own delusions. But the night was far from over. What I did not know was that my swift departure had left my tailored winter coat in the private cloakroom. Later that evening, Vanessa, seething with intense jealousy and confusion over how a supposed low-level data analyst could casually drop $12,000 without blinking, slipped into the coat check area. She dug fiercely through the pockets of my coat, searching for anything she could use to belittle me or expose what she believed was a fraudulent lifestyle. Her manicured fingers brushed against a hard plastic rectangle in the inner pocket. She pulled it out and stared at it under the dim halogen light. It was a VIP security access badge. Across the top in bold silver letters was the name Aegis Capital. It was the exact multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm that Cameron was currently begging for a financial bailout. Vanessa stared at the security badge, a malicious and triumphant smile spreading across her face. In her arrogant and limited mind, there was only one logical explanation for me possessing such an item. She assumed I was a lowly receptionist or a basic administrative assistant at the firm. She assumed I had simply maxed out a fraudulent credit card earlier that night just to look important in front of the family. Holding that badge, Vanessa believed she had just found the perfect ultimate tool to exploit me. She thought she could easily force her pathetic little sister to sneak Cameron's failing business proposal directly onto the desk of the Aegis Capital CEO, bypassing all the corporate security and gatekeepers. She envisioned herself as the brilliant mastermind who would save her husband's firm by using my supposed low-level access. She had absolutely no idea that I was not an assistant at Aegis Capital. I was the founder and the CEO. 3 days had passed since the disastrous vow renewal at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I sat alone at the small Formica kitchen table of my apartment, listening to the distant sounds of city traffic. I need to explain this apartment. 5 years ago, when my business first began to generate massive wealth, I realized a painful truth. My family would completely drain my resources if they ever discovered my financial success. To protect myself, I rented a modest one-bedroom unit in a very average working-class neighborhood. It had cheap linoleum floors that peeled at the corners, thin walls, and second-hand furniture I bought from a thrift store. Whenever my parents or my sister insisted on seeing me, which was rare, and usually only happened when they wanted something, I met them here. It was the perfect camouflage. It kept my actual penthouse and my real life entirely protected from their relentless toxic greed. The loud, aggressive pounding on my front door startled me. I was not expecting company on a Tuesday evening. I walked over and looked through the peephole. My stomach tightened. My sister Vanessa and my father Richard stood in the narrow, dimly lit hallway. Vanessa looked unusually frantic. Her designer makeup was slightly smudged, and she was pacing back and forth, nervously clutching her expensive leather handbag. My father stood rigidly beside her with his arms crossed over his chest, looking deeply inconvenienced and disgusted by his surroundings. I unbolted the door. Before I could even offer a greeting, Vanessa pushed her way violently past me. My father followed close behind her, closing the door and looking around my simple living room with an expression of pure contempt. "We do not have time for pleasantries," Nina, my sister, snapped. She threw her handbag onto my cheap fabric sofa. "I know exactly where you work, and I know exactly what you are going to do for me tonight." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the security badge she had stolen from me at the country club. She dangled it in front of my face like a prize she had won. "Aegis Capital," she said, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "You actually work at Aegis Capital?" I have to admit, I was incredibly surprised. I figured you were just doing mindless data entry for some local failing startup, but you somehow managed to get a job at the biggest venture capital firm on the East Coast. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression. I did not ask her how she got my badge. I already knew she had no boundaries and absolutely no respect for my privacy. "That is my property, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice level. "Hand it back to me right now." She laughed mockingly and pulled the badge away, holding it out of my reach. "Not until you do your job as my sister," she demanded. "Cameron is facing a minor cash flow complication. The market has been unpredictable lately, and his business partners are panicking over a few delayed returns." I knew the actual truth. Cameron was drowning in toxic debt. His boutique investment firm was hemorrhaging money and facing imminent collapse. He had over-leveraged his entire portfolio on terrible commercial real estate bets and fraudulent tech startups. It was not a minor cash flow complication. It was total financial ruin, and he was entirely to blame for his gross incompetence. "He has a comprehensive restructuring pitch ready." Vanessa continued, her voice rising with desperate entitlement. "He needs a $20 million buyout to stabilize his portfolios and save the firm. He has been trying to get a meeting with the CEO of Aegis Capital for 6 long weeks, but the corporate gatekeepers keep blocking his emails and rejecting his calls. That is exactly where you come in. You are going to take his pitch portfolio," Vanessa commanded, pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are going to use your little assistant access badge to bypass the security protocols on the top floor of your building. I do not care if you have to sneak into the office after hours or bribe a late-night janitor. You will place Cameron's file directly on the CEO's desk by tomorrow morning, so it is the very first thing he sees." The absolute audacity of her demand hung heavily in the air. She stole my fiancé 8 years ago. She humiliated me at her vow renewal just 3 days ago. And now she was breaking into my home to demand I commit corporate espionage to save the very man who betrayed me. "I will do no such thing," I said calmly, firmly planting my feet. "I am not compromising my professional integrity for Cameron. His business failures are his own responsibility. If Aegis Capital rejected his meetings, it is because his firm is a massive financial liability. I am not risking my job and my freedom to save a man who walked out on me." That is when my father stepped forward. He did not yell or raise his voice. He used the quiet, calculating tone that always preceded his worst acts of emotional cruelty. "You are going to listen to your sister Nina," he said coldly. "Cameron is family. We support family in this house, and we protect our own." I looked at him in sheer disbelief. "He is not my family dad. He is the man who shattered my life while you all stood by and cheered for him. I owe him absolutely nothing." My father's eyes narrowed into a dark, menacing glare. "You owe this family everything," he countered, "and if you refuse to cooperate right now, I will make sure you lose the only thing you actually care about in this world." He paused, letting the cruel threat hang in the air. "Your grandfather's lake house." My heart skipped a painful beat. When my grandfather passed away, he left his rustic, beautiful lake house to me in his will. It was my ultimate sanctuary. It was the only place I had ever felt truly safe and unconditionally loved growing up. The smell of the pine trees and the sound of the water lapping against the old wooden dock were my most precious memories. But the estate had been tied up in probate court for years, and my father was the primary legal executor. He had the immense power to delay the transfer indefinitely or challenge the deed based on technicalities. The probate period is ending next month, my father said smoothly, sensing my sudden vulnerability. As the executor, I have wide discretion over the final distribution of assets to cover outstanding estate taxes. If you do not help and secure this buyout from Aegis Capital, I will legally block the transfer of the lake house to your name. I will tie the property up in expensive litigation for the next 10 years, or simply sell it at public auction to cover imaginary estate debts. You will never set foot on that property again, Nina. I was actively weaponizing the only pure memory I had left. He was completely willing to destroy his own father's dying wish, just to protect Vanessa's fragile social status and Cameron's fraudulent career. I looked at the two of them standing in my kitchen. They were completely devoid of empathy or human decency. They would strip me of everything I loved just to keep themselves afloat. But as I looked at their arrogant faces, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I realized that fighting them directly right now was a waste of my energy. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their firm belief that I was nothing more than a helpless subordinate, that they were walking willingly into their own destruction. I let out a long, defeated sigh, pretending that his ruthless threat had completely broken my spirit. I allowed my shoulders to slump and looked down at the linoleum floor, mimicking the exact posture of the weak girl they expected me to be. "Fine," I whispered, keeping my voice small and defeated. "I will help you. But I am not sneaking into any executive offices. If corporate security catches me, I will be fired immediately and face severe criminal charges." Vanessa rolled her eyes in deep annoyance. "Then how are you going to get his pitch to the CEO, you useless girl? We are running out of time and Cameron needs this money by Friday." I walked over to the small kitchen counter. I picked up a blue pen and a torn piece of scrap paper. I carefully wrote down a private, highly secured email address. It was a direct line bypassing all corporate filters and administrative assistance. I walked back and handed the scrap of paper to Vanessa. "Do not use the public submission portal," I said quietly. "Send Cameron's complete financial portfolio directly to this email address tonight. It goes straight to the executive board's private server. It will bypass all the security checks he has been failing." Vanessa snatched the paper from my hand, holding it up to the light as if inspecting it for tricks. "Tell the CEO that Nina sent you," I added. I forced my voice to sound desperate and pathetic, as if I were clinging to some imaginary shred of corporate importance. "Make sure Cameron mentions my name in the subject line of the email. They will pay attention if you tell them Nina personally recommended the file." Vanessa burst into loud, mocking laughter. The harsh sound echoed against the thin walls of my decoy apartment. She looked at my father, who was shaking his head with a condescending smirk on his face. "Tell the CEO that Nina sent you," Vanessa repeated, mimicking my voice with cruel exaggeration. "Oh my God, Nina, you are completely delusional. Do you honestly think the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm cares about a recommendation from a low-level data clerk? You probably just fetch their coffee and organize their printed files. We will use the email address, but Cameron will be using his own prestigious name. We are not going to embarrass ourselves by mentioning a nobody like you." She slipped my security badge into her expensive purse alongside the scrap of paper. "I am keeping this badge just in case you gave us a fake email address," she threatened. "If Cameron does not get a positive response by tomorrow morning, we will be back. Let us go, Dad. This place smells like poverty and failure." My father turned toward the door, not even bothering to say goodbye or acknowledge my existence. They walked out of my apartment, leaving the door wide open behind them, entirely triumphant in their perceived victory. They truly believed they had successfully bullied and extorted their pathetic younger sister into saving their failing empire. I walked over and gently closed the door, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying click. The pathetic, defeated posture vanished from my body instantly. I stood tall and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I walked over to my kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of cold water, feeling completely at peace. Vanessa and my father had just sealed their own spectacular ruin. They were completely oblivious to the reality of the massive trap they had just eagerly walked into. They had no idea that I was not a receptionist. I was not a low-level assistant fetching coffee at Aegis Capital. I was the founder. I was the owner. I was the CEO. And tomorrow morning Cameron would be stepping directly into my boardroom. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the towering glass facade of the Aegis Capital building. On the 55th floor, the executive boardroom offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. It was a room specifically designed to intimidate visiting clients with its massive mahogany table, pristine leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made everyone else look small. Cameron and Vanessa walked out of the private elevator and stepped into the plush reception area. They moved with an obnoxious, overconfident swagger. Vanessa wore a vibrant red designer dress and excessive diamond jewelry, clearly trying to project an image of established wealth. Cameron was dressed in a tailored, imported suit, clutching his expensive leather briefcase like a shield. They were accompanied by two of Cameron's senior business partners, who looked visibly nervous about the upcoming pitch. Cameron and Vanessa, however, were completely radiating arrogance. As they were escorted into the boardroom by a polite junior executive, Vanessa could not resist bragging. She looked around the pristine room and laughed loudly. She told the junior executives that they did not need to worry about the usual corporate formalities today. She explicitly bragged that they had a secret inside connection directly to the CEO. She actually mocked my name right there in the boardroom. She joked that a lowly data clerk named Nina had managed to slip their file onto the right desk, and that they were simply here to collect their $20 million buyout. The junior executives exchanged confused glances, but remained completely silent out of professional courtesy. Cameron leaned back in his plush leather chair, resting his hands comfortably behind his head. He confidently assured his anxious business partners that the deal was already secured. He bragged that he knew how to play the corporate game better than anyone else in the financial district. He was absolutely certain he was about to walk out of that room $20 million richer. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. The idle chatter in the room instantly died. I walked in. I was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal designer suit. My hair was pulled back into a sleek professional style. I carried nothing but a single digital tablet. I did not look at Cameron. I did not even glance at Vanessa. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead and walked with absolute authority toward the head of the long table. The moment I crossed the threshold, every single junior executive and corporate associate in the room immediately stood up. They respectfully stepped back from the table and deferred to me. "Good morning, Madam CEO," the lead associate said smoothly. "We have the portfolio loaded and ready for your review." I took my seat at the head of the table. I placed my tablet down and finally raised my eyes. I looked directly at Cameron. The physical reaction was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying to witness. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face. All the color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking physically sick. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Vanessa was frozen in her chair. Her eyes darted wildly between me and the junior executives who were still standing respectfully at attention. She looked at the heavy mahogany doors as if expecting someone else to walk in. She simply could not process the reality of what was happening. Her brain refused to accept that the pathetic sister she had bullied and mocked in a cheap decoy apartment last night was actually the ultimate authority in this room. I did not give them a moment to recover. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The massive digital monitor on the wall behind me flared to life. It displayed the highly confidential internal financial portfolios of Cameron's boutique investment firm. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon dissecting a specimen. "Let us review the restructuring pitch you submitted last night, Cameron," I said evenly. You are asking Aegis Capital for a $20 million capital injection. You claim your firm is facing a temporary liquidity issue due to sudden market fluctuations. However, your own internal data tells a remarkably different story. I swiped my finger across the tablet. The screen changed to show a series of highlighted banking records and property evaluations. I systematically went through his numbers, leaving absolutely no room for argument. I pointed out the fraudulent accounting tricks he had used to artificially inflate the value of his commercial real estate holdings. I exposed the toxic assets he had buried in offshore shell companies. I showed the board the massive unauthorized withdrawals he had made from client accounts to cover his own personal debts. I mathematically proved that his firm was not experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. His firm was entirely insolvent. He had over-leveraged his clients' money on terrible investments to fund a lavish personal lifestyle for himself and my sister. I looked at Cameron's business partners. They were staring at the screen in absolute horror. They clearly had no idea how deep the financial rot truly went. Cameron had been lying to them too, hiding the catastrophic losses behind fabricated spreadsheets. Your firm is not a worthwhile investment, Cameron, I stated clearly, allowing my words to echo in the silent boardroom. Your firm is a massive financial liability. Your accounting practices border on criminal negligence. You are hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate, and you came here expecting Aegis Capital to blindly bail you out of your own gross incompetence. I do not fund fraudulent enterprises. Cameron was sweating profusely. He tugged nervously at his collar, trying to find words. Nina, please, he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. You do not understand the market pressures we have been under. I can fix this. I just need a bridge loan to stabilize the accounts. I just need a little more time to turn things around. I tapped the tablet again, shutting off the screen. Time is not going to fix gross incompetence, Cameron, I replied. The numbers do not lie. You are completely bankrupt. Vanessa finally found her voice. She stood up, her face flushed with a toxic mixture of rage and panic. This is a setup, she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. You planned this, Nina. You tricked us into coming here. You are just doing this because you are a jealous, bitter woman who cannot get over the fact that Cameron chose me instead of you. I looked at my sister with nothing but cold indifference. I did not trick you, Vanessa. I gave you the email address exactly as you demanded. You are the one who eagerly sent the completely unedited financial records directly to my private server. You handed me the exact proof of your husband's financial fraud on a silver platter. I did not have to do anything but read the file you so proudly delivered to my inbox. Cameron looked at his business partners in sheer desperation. They were furious. One of them actually slammed his fist on the table, declaring that he was contacting federal regulators immediately. They grabbed their briefcases and stormed out of the boardroom without looking back at Cameron. They knew their careers were tied to a sinking ship, and they were desperate to abandon it before the authorities arrived. Once the partners left, Cameron completely broke down. The polished, arrogant businessman vanished entirely. He dismissed the remaining junior executives from the room with a frantic wave of his hand. When the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving just the three of us in the massive room, Cameron literally fell out of his chair. He dropped to his knees on the carpeted floor. He crawled toward the head of the table, abandoning all sense of dignity. He clasped his hands together and began openly sobbing. It was a truly pathetic display. Nina, please, he begged, tears streaming down his face. Please do not do this to me. I will lose everything. They will take my house. They will take my firm. I will go to prison for those offshore accounts. Please, Nina. I know I hurt you. I know I made a terrible mistake 8 years ago. I never should have left you. You were always the smart one. You were always the one I truly loved. Vanessa manipulated me. She forced me into this expensive lifestyle and made me steal to pay for it. Please save me. I still love you, Nina. Vanessa gasped in pure shock. She stared at her husband, who was currently on his knees begging her sister for mercy and actively throwing their entire marriage under the bus to save himself from prison. I looked down at the man I once planned to marry. There was no anger left in me. There was only absolute disgust. I did not yell. I did not insult him. I simply reached forward and pressed a sleek silver button embedded in the surface of the conference table. A soft chime echoed through the room and a small green light illuminated near the center microphone. Cameron, I said, my voice perfectly steady. You should know that per standard corporate compliance policy, every meeting in the executive boardroom of Aegis Capital is automatically recorded for legal and quality assurance purposes. The audio and video files go directly to our legal department. That includes your entire presentation, your admission of fraudulent accounting practices, and the pathetic begging you just subjected us to. Cameron froze. His eyes locked onto the green recording light. The realization of what he had just done completely shattered him. He had just confessed to corporate fraud and admitted to hating his wife, all while being legally recorded by a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. Your pitch is officially denied, Cameron, I said. You can find the exit yourselves. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them. I watched through the glass walls as Cameron and Vanessa practically stumbled toward the elevators, looking like two people who had just stepped out of a violent car crash. Word of Cameron, admitting to severe corporate fraud on a legally recorded line, spread through his firm faster than a wildfire. By the time I arrived back at my penthouse, the financial news networks were already reporting the sudden collapse. His senior partners held an emergency vote and officially ousted him before the stock markets even closed. Cameron was entirely disgraced. My personal phone started ringing, and my mother called me 14 times in 2 hours. When I finally answered, she did not ask how I was doing or how I managed to build a multi-billion-dollar company from nothing. Instead, she shrieked into the receiver, demanding my immediate presence at their upscale suburban estate. She called it an emergency family tribunal and ordered me to fix the catastrophic mess she claimed I deliberately created. I drove to the sprawling gated community where my parents lived, wanting to see exactly how far their shared delusion would stretch. Their house was a massive display of artificial wealth. I parked in the circular driveway and walked directly inside. My parents were waiting in their lavish, formal living room. Cameron sat on the expensive white sofa, staring blankly at the floor like a broken man. Vanessa paced like a caged animal, her eyes red and puffy. As soon as I walked in, my mother launched her vicious attack. She did not hold Cameron accountable for his fraudulent accounting or blame him for risking his client's money. Instead, she pointed a shaking finger directly at me and screamed that I had orchestrated the entire firm collapse out of petty jealousy. "You planned this from the beginning, Nina," my mother shouted, her face flushed with absolute rage. "You deliberately lured them into your boardroom just to publicly humiliate him. You destroyed your sister's husband because you are still bitter that he left you 8 years ago. You are a vindictive and jealous woman." I stood completely unfazed by her screaming. "I did not lure him anywhere, Mom," I replied calmly. "He brought his fraudulent business to my company begging for a financial bailout. I simply looked at the math and denied a bad investment. It is not my fault he steals from his own clients to fund your daughter's luxury lifestyle." My father slammed his hand down on the glass coffee table. "Enough," he demanded. "We are not here to discuss Cameron's business practices. We are here to discuss how you are going to fix this family today." He stood up, projecting the intimidating authority he had used to control my entire life. "You are going to use your newly discovered wealth to wire $5 million to Cameron's personal accounts by tomorrow morning. That money will clear his immediate debts and keep the federal regulators away. It is the absolute least you can do after embarrassing your sister today." I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed in the tense living room. "You want me to hand over $5 million to a man who committed corporate fraud just so you can keep pretending you are a perfect high society family?" I asked. "I am not paying a single cent to clear his debts. He made his bed and now he is going to rot in it. I owe this family absolutely nothing." Vanessa stopped her frantic pacing. She turned to look at me, and a very dark, sickening smile crept across her face. The panic in her eyes was suddenly replaced by a deeply malicious triumph. She walked over to the coffee table and picked up a thick manila folder. "You really think you hold all the power now just because you have some money?" Vanessa sneered. "You think you can just walk away from us and play the untouchable corporate boss. But you forgot something very important, Nina. You forgot who controls the things you actually care about." She tossed the folder onto the glass table. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped right in front of me. When Cameron's firm started failing, we needed liquidity fast. Vanessa explained, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. We needed a massive bridge loan to keep the creditors away. But we did not have any assets left to pledge. So Dad and I got very creative. We leveraged the grandfather's lake house. My breath caught in my throat. The lake house was my ultimate sanctuary. It was the only pure memory I had left of a man who actually loved me unconditionally. My grandfather had left that property specifically to me. My father was the legal executor of the estate, and he had been intentionally delaying the transfer of the deed to my name for years, using legal loopholes to maintain his control. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. My father stepped forward, completely unapologetic about his actions. "I am the executor of the estate," he stated proudly. "I used my legal authority to pledge the lake house property as collateral for a high-interest corporate bridge loan to save Cameron's business. Since Cameron defaulted on his payments today, the regional bank has officially called the debt. They are seizing the property by the end of the week." I stared at them in profound disgust. They had forged the internal estate documents and illegally leveraged a property that did not belong to them just to fund Cameron's fraud. They had sacrificed my grandfather's legacy to protect a liar. "You forged the collateral documents," I said, staring directly into my father's eyes. "You committed felony bank fraud to put a lien on my inheritance." "Prove it," Vanessa taunted, stepping closer to me. "The paperwork is filed. The regional bank has the deed. The foreclosure notice was issued this afternoon. By Friday, the bank will seize the lake house and auction it off to the highest bidder. You will lose the only place you have ever truly loved." Vanessa crossed her arms over her chest, looking incredibly pleased with her sickening betrayal. "Your billions mean absolutely nothing if you cannot save the one thing you actually care about, Nina. So you can either wire the $5 million right now to clear Cameron's debt and save the property, or you can watch a wrecking ball tear down your precious childhood memories. The choice is yours, Madam CEO." They stood there like a pack of starving wolves waiting for me to surrender. My mother had a look of eager anticipation on her face. She was fully ready to accept my $5 million wire transfer to keep her precious country club friends from discovering the truth. My father stood tall, believing his absolute authority over the legal estate made him untouchable. And Vanessa simply smiled, her red lips curled into a cruel arc, thinking she had outsmarted the billionaire sister she had always secretly feared. They genuinely believed that threatening a house made of wood and stone would bring me to my knees. They severely underestimated the vast reach of my resources and the sheer magnitude of the power I wielded in the financial sector. A regional bank was a trivial obstacle to a firm like Aegis Capital. The fact that they thought a local foreclosure notice was a checkmate proved just how small their minds truly were. They were playing checkers while I owned the entire board. I was about to show them what real corporate warfare looked like. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and calmly pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contacts list. I found the private number I needed and pressed call. I put the phone on speaker so the entire room could hear the conversation. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. "Acquisitions Director speaking." I kept my eyes locked directly on Vanessa's arrogant face as I gave my final devastating order. "Execute the hostile takeover of the regional bank," I said. "Buy their debt portfolio immediately." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, leaving my family standing in a room that suddenly felt like a tomb. The silence in the living room was absolute. Vanessa's arms slowly dropped to her sides. My father took a stumbling step backward, his confidence shattering into a million pieces. They realized in that terrifying instant that I was not going to negotiate with terrorists. I was going to buy the bank that held the terror. I was going to become the very institution that held their fraudulent debt. I was no longer the victim of their malicious family games. I was the absolute architect of their impending and complete destruction. While my family was likely tearing each other apart in their suburban living room, I was already 3 steps ahead. I did not wait for the regional bank to process my hostile takeover through standard channels. I had my lead acquisitions director meet me directly at the Aegis Capital headquarters the moment I arrived. We sat in my private office overlooking the financial district and initiated an aggressive and highly classified corporate maneuver. We targeted the exact portfolio containing the toxic debt my father had illegally secured, using my grandfather's lake house as collateral. But I did not stop there. I instructed my team to dig deeper into Vanessa and Cameron's financial liabilities. It did not take long to discover that their primary residence, their massive six-bedroom mansion in the suburbs, was heavily mortgaged. They had refinanced it 3 times. I bought that debt too. I bought every single financial obligation attached to their names. I authorized the immediate transfer of millions of dollars to assume total control over their lives. In less than 48 hours, I completely owned my sister and her fraudulent husband. While I was meticulously executing their financial ruin, Vanessa was busy living in a state of absolute and severe denial. She refused to accept that her fake empire was crumbling around her. Instead of cutting her losses and hiring a competent defense attorney, she decided to throw a lavish dinner party. She invited 20 of her most elite snobby socialite friends to her mansion. She hired a private chef, premium waitstaff, and a string quartet. She was bleeding cash she did not have just to maintain the illusion of her social supremacy. Her strategy was painfully predictable. She was going to use this dinner party to spin a false narrative about Cameron's sudden departure from his investment firm. According to the extensive network of socialites who love to gossip, Vanessa spent the entire first hour of the party pouring expensive champagne and lying through her teeth. She mingled with her wealthy friends, telling them that Cameron had simply outgrown his former partners. She claimed he was voluntarily stepping down to transition into a highly exclusive role as a private wealth consultant for ultra-high net worth individuals. It was a completely fabricated story designed to hide the fact that he had been unceremoniously fired for gross incompetence and severe corporate fraud. Cameron played right along with her, standing by the marble fireplace and nodding humbly as if he had just made a brilliant career move. The climax of Vanessa's delusional evening was meant to be a grand announcement. She gathered her 20 guests in her massive formal dining room. Vanessa clinked her crystal glass with a silver spoon to command the attention of the room. She stood at the head of the table radiating fake confidence. She announced that, to celebrate Cameron's exciting new career direction, they were going to liquidate some of their surplus family real estate. She explicitly mentioned a beautiful rustic lake house that had been in the family for generations. She told her friends that she had personally secured a lucrative deal with a luxury developer to bulldoze the old property and build modern lakeside condominiums. She was selling my grandfather's legacy to cover her own massive debts and framing it as a brilliant real estate move. She never got to finish her self-congratulatory speech. A few moments later, a confused member of the waitstaff walked into the formal dining room. I was followed immediately by a professional legal courier, and he did not care about the strict social etiquette of Vanessa's dinner party. He bypassed the catering staff and walked directly up to the head of the long table. "Are you Vanessa and Cameron?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet murmurs of the wealthy guests. Vanessa looked highly offended by the sudden intrusion. "Yes," she snapped, her face flushing with irritation. "But we are in the middle of a private event. You cannot just walk in here. Who let you inside?" The courier did not answer her question. He simply reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents bound by heavy rubber bands. He placed them directly onto the center of the pristine dining table, right next to Vanessa's crystal champagne glass. "You have been officially served," he stated flatly. "Have a good evening." The courier turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned and heavy silence in his wake. The 20 elite guests stared at the thick stack of papers. Whispers immediately broke out around the table. Cameron looked visibly sick. He reached forward with trembling hands and pulled the thick stack of documents toward him. He broke the rubber bands and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. "What is it?" Vanessa demanded, trying to keep her voice light and unbothered for her guests. "Is it just some boring corporate paperwork for your new consulting business, Cameron?" Cameron did not answer. He was staring at the bold black text on the first page. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He dropped the papers onto the table as if they were physically burning his bare hands. "They are foreclosure notices," he whispered. His voice was so quiet the guests had to lean forward to hear him. "And eviction orders." Vanessa let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "That is impossible," she said, waving her hand dismissively. She reached over and grabbed the documents herself. "There must be some kind of clerical error. The regional bank gave us a 90-day extension on the bridge loan. I spoke to the loan officer myself." She scanned the first page and her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. The documents were not from the local regional bank. The paperwork clearly stated that the regional bank no longer held the debt on the bridge loan. The debt had been aggressively purchased in full by a massive parent company. The new owner of the debt was demanding immediate and total repayment. Because the debt had already defaulted, the new owner was executing their strict legal right to seize all collateral immediately. Vanessa flipped frantically to the second page. The second document was not about the lake house, it was about the very mansion they were currently standing in. The paperwork detailed that the massive mortgage on their primary residence had also been purchased by the exact same parent company. Due to the cross-default clauses triggered by Cameron's massive financial failures, the new owner was foreclosing on this house as well. They were officially losing everything. "This cannot be real!" Vanessa panicked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. The wealthy guests were now openly staring, some pulling out their phones to text other people in their social circle about the unfolding disaster. "Who bought the debt, Cameron? Who is doing this to us?" Before Cameron could even attempt to answer, a new voice echoed through the silent dining room. "I did." Every single head at the table turned toward the wide arched doorway of the dining room. I was standing there. I wore a sharp, dark trench coat over my business suit, looking completely calm and utterly in control. I stepped forward into the room, the heels of my shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. I walked past the shocked socialites and the silent catering staff. I stopped right next to the table, looking down at my sister, who was hyperventilating, clutching the foreclosure notices like a lifeline. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute authority, making sure every single person in that room heard my exact words clearly. "You do not own the estate anymore, Vanessa," I announced, the truth slicing through her pathetic web of lies. "You cannot sell the lake house to a luxury developer to cover your husband's massive corporate fraud. I own the lake house. I bought your toxic debt and I own the deed." Vanessa stared at me, her mouth opening and closing in sheer terror. She finally realized the absolute magnitude of the mistake she had made by threatening me. She had tried to leverage my past against me, and in return, I had literally purchased her entire future. "And you do not own this mansion either." I continued, my gaze shifting briefly to Cameron, who was looking at the floor in total defeat. "You have exactly 48 hours to pack your bags and vacate this primary residence. I bought the debt on your house too." The silence in the dining room was deafening. The elite guests were completely paralyzed. I turned and walked out of the mansion, leaving them to drown in the ruin they had built for themselves. The night air felt crisp and clean against my face as I stepped out into the driveway, ending their reign of terror forever and a day. The 48-hour eviction notice I delivered at that disastrous dinner party was not an empty threat. It was a strict legal deadline, and my corporate legal team was perfectly positioned to enforce it down to the final second. I did not have to lift a single finger to watch the destruction unfold. I simply received regular updates from the private security contractors I had hired to oversee the property seizure. According to their detailed reports, the immediate reality of sudden homelessness completely shattered my sister's marriage overnight. When the fake money vanished, so did the fake love they so proudly paraded around their exclusive social circles. The security team could hear them screaming at each other from the driveway as they frantically packed their belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. Cameron furiously blamed Vanessa for bleeding him dry with her reckless spending, her endless rotation of designer clothes, and her constant pathetic need to impress her wealthy socialite friends. Vanessa shrieked right back at him, violently throwing his expensive customized golf clubs onto the manicured front lawn. She loudly blamed him for being a completely untalented fraud who only got lucky because he stole a smart woman's ideas 8 years ago. Their golden romance was finally exposed for exactly what it always was: a shallow transactional partnership built entirely on greed, ego, and deep delusion. When the heavy rented moving trucks finally pulled away from the foreclosed mansion, they drove in completely opposite directions. They did not even bother to say goodbye to each other, ending their toxic union right there on the pavement. While Vanessa and Cameron were busy tearing each other apart on their front lawn, my parents were spiraling into a state of absolute and unchecked panic. Richard and Patricia simply could not accept the harsh reality that their golden child was now effectively homeless and publicly disgraced. They were absolutely terrified of what their snobby country club friends would say when the vicious gossip inevitably spread through their elite community. In their desperate, frantic attempt to maintain the illusion of their perfect high society family, they made a catastrophic financial decision. My data analysts at Aegis Capital flagged the massive transactions almost immediately. Cameron still had enormous outstanding margin calls from his fraudulent trades, and angry institutional investors were threatening aggressive criminal action. To cover those immediate overwhelming debts and keep their precious son-in-law out of federal handcuffs, my parents quietly leveraged their own remaining assets. They secretly put up their sprawling country club home as collateral and blindly drained their entire retirement portfolios. They threw millions of dollars of their own hard-earned money into a massive financial black hole, trying to plug a rapidly sinking ship. I sat quietly at my heavy mahogany desk, watching the digital reports flood into my highly secure server. My parents were willingly sacrificing their entire life savings and their own primary residence just to protect people who had continually lied to them. They were financially drowning themselves out of pure stubborn pride, believing they could somehow magically outspend the severe consequences of Cameron's extensive crimes. But my mother was not going to go down quietly. Patricia always firmly believed that if she screamed loud enough and cried hard enough, she could force the world to bend entirely to her will. She quickly realized that I held all the financial leverage, so she decided to attack the one thing she thought I cared about protecting above all else: my pristine corporate reputation. 2 days after they completely drained their retirement accounts, my director of building security called my private office line. He gravely informed me that my parents had deliberately bypassed the outer security plaza and were currently standing in the main lobby of the Aegis Capital headquarters. But they did not come alone to negotiate a peaceful surrender. They had brought a highly aggressive local news crew with them. I pulled up the live security feed on my large desktop monitor. My mother was standing in the center of my pristine marble lobby, putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She was sobbing uncontrollably into a tissue while my father stood firmly beside her, looking stoic and deeply betrayed. A local news reporter was holding a microphone, eagerly capturing every single fake dramatic tear. Patricia was looking directly into the camera lens, painting herself as a devoted, loving mother who was being ruthlessly victimized by a heartless billionaire daughter. She wailed to the reporter that I was illegally evicting my own flesh and blood out of pure spite and unresolved childhood jealousy. She loudly claimed I was a vindictive monster who cared far more about ruthless corporate profits than basic family loyalty. She was heavily banking on the fact that I would be so terrified of a public relations scandal that I would immediately wire them millions of dollars just to make the flashing cameras go away. She genuinely thought public shame was my ultimate weakness. She was entirely wrong. I did not hide in my executive suite trembling at the thought of bad press. I did not send my armed security guards to forcefully remove them from the premises, which would only give the news crew exactly the dramatic, violent footage they wanted to broadcast on the evening news. I calmly stood up, picked up a thick, heavy manila folder from my desk, walked to the private elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. When the polished steel elevator doors slid open, the eager reporter immediately spotted me. He practically shoved his heavy-set cameraman forward, pushing the bright microphone toward my face and aggressively demanding a statement about my parents' severe allegations of elder abuse and corporate cruelty. I maintained a perfectly calm and pleasant expression. I did not raise my hand to block the camera lens or attempt to hide my face. Instead, I stepped fully into the bright, harsh lights and politely invited the cameraman to move even closer. I looked directly at my mother, whose fake dramatic tears instantly dried up the absolute moment she saw the sheer, unwavering confidence radiating from my posture. Her performance severely faltered as she realized I was not intimidated. I turned back to the reporter and spoke clearly into the microphone, ensuring my voice carried perfectly across the vast room. "I am very glad you are here today," I said, my voice echoing off the high marble walls of the corporate lobby. Transparency in the financial sector is incredibly important to Aegis Capital and to me personally. My parents are currently claiming on your live broadcast that I am evicting them over a simple family disagreement. They want the public to believe I am acting out of petty spite. But the truth is far more serious and incredibly relevant to the public interest. I opened the heavy manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of certified public court filings. I handed them directly to the bewildered news reporter, making absolutely sure the cameraman captured the official government seals stamped on the front pages. "What you are currently holding are certified financial records from federal regulators," I announced to the dead silent lobby. "They contain undeniable, legally binding proof that Richard and Patricia committed severe corporate tax fraud. For the past 5 years, they have been illegally funneling their heavily subsidized commercial business loans through hidden offshore shell companies. They did this to directly fund my sister Vanessa's extreme luxury lifestyle, avoiding taxes while living vastly beyond their means. They deliberately committed federal fraud to buy designer clothes, luxury vehicles, and exclusive country club memberships. I am not illegally evicting them. I am fully cooperating with the federal authorities, who are currently stepping in to freeze all of their remaining assets pending a massive criminal investigation." My father staggered backward, as if he had been violently physically struck by my words. My mother let out a strangled, horrified gasp, tightly covering her mouth with her trembling hands. They had purposefully brought a professional news crew to my corporate lobby, hoping to publicly shame me into total financial compliance. Instead, they had just provided a live, high-definition television broadcast for the exact moment I handed federal evidence of their own felony tax fraud directly to the local media. They were completely and totally ruined on live television. The news reporter stood completely frozen, holding the thick stack of federal indictments in his hands. He quickly realized he was no longer covering a petty family dispute over real estate, but was actively breaking a massive corporate fraud scandal on live television. I immediately signaled his cameraman to zoom in closely on the certified documents, entirely ignoring my parents, who were now frantically trying to back away toward the revolving glass doors. Richard grabbed Patricia's arm, attempting to pull her out of the building, but the security guards I had stationed at the exits smoothly stepped forward, blocking their path. The federal authorities I had contacted earlier that morning were already pulling into the front plaza, their unmarked vehicles visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My parents had unknowingly walked directly into the exact trap they thought they were setting for me. I stood perfectly still, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the pristine marble floors of my empire. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles outside my corporate lobby signaled the absolute end of my parents, while they were being escorted into the back of unmarked government sedans. Vanessa was watching the live news broadcast from a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city. The 48-hour eviction notice had forced her out of her mansion, and her pristine socialite life had evaporated into dust. Cameron was nowhere to be found, having fled to secure his own legal counsel the moment the foreclosure notices hit the dining room table. Vanessa was completely and entirely alone. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were declined. Her parents, the ultimate enablers who had shielded her from consequences her entire life, were currently sitting in federal holding cells. Panic is a powerful motivator, but combined with Vanessa's deeply ingrained arrogance, it became a recipe for catastrophic stupidity. She refused to accept defeat. In her delusional mind, she believed there had to be a way to strike back at me and secure enough cash to flee the state or hire an elite defense attorney. That is when she remembered the decoy apartment. During our confrontation at my rented apartment just days earlier, Vanessa had watched me type in the security code to the secondary deadbolt. She had a photographic memory for numbers, a skill she usually reserved for memorizing credit card limits and country club member IDs. She wrongly assumed that because I kept the apartment as a secret base, I must also keep highly sensitive corporate intellectual property stored on the local network there. She figured that a multi-billion-dollar CEO, hiding in a working-class neighborhood, would definitely keep her most valuable trade secrets off the main corporate grid. It was a completely flawed and desperate assumption, but desperation breeds reckless action. Facing imminent ruin, Vanessa resorted to outright criminality. At 2 in the morning, Vanessa drove a rented compact car to my decoy apartment. She parked 2 blocks away and pulled the hood of a dark jacket over her head, terrified that her former socialite friends might somehow spot her in such a miserable neighborhood. She crept through the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding against her ribs. She reached my door and punched the 5-digit code into the electronic deadbolt. The lock clicked open. She slipped inside and closed the door quickly behind her, completely unaware that my private security team was monitoring her entry through hidden cameras the moment her foot crossed the threshold. I received the silent alert on my phone while sitting in my penthouse, but I did not dispatch the police. I simply watched the live feed and let her dig her own grave. Vanessa frantically searched the small apartment. She bypassed the cheap thrift store furniture and headed straight for the small bedroom I had converted into a home office. The room contained a basic desk, a filing cabinet, and a single desktop computer. She booted up the machine. Her hands were shaking as she navigated the desktop screen. She was sweating profusely, terrified that I might walk through the door at any second. She clicked through the standard system folders, finding nothing but blank documents and basic accounting software. Then she spotted it. A highly encrypted folder sitting directly in the center of the screen, boldly labeled Aegis Capital Confidential Mergers and Acquisitions. Vanessa gasped in pure triumph. She genuinely believed she had just struck gold. She pulled a high-capacity flash drive from her pocket and shoved it into the computer port. She initiated the download. She watched the progress bar inch across the screen, her mind racing with greedy calculations. She knew that Aegis Capital was in the final stages of acquiring a massive European tech conglomerate. If she possessed the internal valuation models and the bidding strategies, she could easily sell that intellectual property to my biggest corporate rival for millions of dollars in untraceable cash. She would have enough money to vanish to an island with no extradition treaty and leave me dealing with a catastrophic corporate leak. The download finished. She yanked the flash drive out of the port, shoved it deep into her pocket, and fled the apartment as quickly as she had arrived. She felt like a mastermind. She truly thought she had finally outsmarted the sister she despised. The next morning, Vanessa did not waste a single second. She drove straight to the downtown financial district and walked into the towering glass headquarters of Zenith Financial. Zenith was my absolute biggest corporate rival. The CEO was a ruthless, aggressive man named Marcus Thorne, who had been trying to outbid Aegis Capital for years. Vanessa approached the front desk, demanding an immediate emergency meeting with Marcus. She used her fading socialite charm and explicitly stated that she possessed stolen proprietary data regarding the upcoming Aegis Capital European merger. The mere mention of my company's vulnerable data was enough to bypass the standard gatekeepers. Within 20 minutes, Vanessa was escorted to the top floor and ushered into a sleek, modern conference room. Marcus Thorne walked in looking highly skeptical but undeniably intrigued. He was a shark in a tailored suit, always hungry for leverage. He took a seat across from Vanessa, placing his hands flat on the glass table. He demanded to know exactly what she was offering and why he should risk engaging in corporate espionage with a disgraced former socialite. Vanessa sat up straight, trying to project the arrogant confidence she used to wield at her country club dinners. She placed the silver flash drive on the glass table between them. I have the complete internal valuation models for Aegis Capital's European tech acquisition, Vanessa stated, her voice thick with desperate bravado. I have Nina's maximum bid limits, her risk assessments, and her entire structural strategy. You can use this data to undercut her bid and steal the merger right out from under her. It will cost her billions. I am willing to hand over full exclusive access to this drive right now for a wire transfer of $2 million, to an offshore account of my choosing. Marcus stared at the flash drive. $2 million was absolute pocket change for a firm like Zenith Financial, especially if it meant securing a multi-billion-dollar European asset and publicly humiliating Aegis Capital. It was an incredibly tempting offer, but Marcus was not a fool. He needed to verify the authenticity of the data before he authorized any untraceable wire transfers. He pulled his sleek silver laptop from his briefcase and opened it on the table. "Let us see what you actually have," Marcus said, his voice cold and calculating. "If this data is legitimate, we have a deal. If you are wasting my time, I will have security throw you out onto the street." Vanessa confidently slid the flash drive across the smooth glass. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smug, self-satisfied smile. She was already imagining the warm sun on a tropical beach far away from her foreclosed mansion and her shattered marriage. She thought about how furious I would be when the media announced Zenith Financial had stolen my biggest acquisition. She believed she had won the ultimate victory. Marcus plugged the flash drive into the side of his laptop. The screen reflected in his sharp, dark eyes. He clicked on the folder prominently labeled Aegis Capital Confidential Mergers and Acquisitions. The folder opened instantly. There were no encryption prompts. There were no security passwords required. That alone should have been the very first massive red flag for a seasoned corporate executive. But Marcus clicked the primary master file, eagerly expecting to see complex financial spreadsheets and proprietary bidding algorithms. The file opened. Vanessa waited for Marcus to smile. She waited for him to reach for his phone and authorize her $2 million wire transfer. Instead, the color rapidly drained from his face. His jaw tightened and he looked up at Vanessa with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive whisper. Vanessa frowned, her smug smile faltering. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning forward. "That is the Aegis Capital proprietary data. That is Nina's entire European merger strategy." Marcus aggressively turned the laptop around and shoved it across the glass table directly toward her. "You are completely out of your mind," he spat. "Do you honestly think I'm going to pay you $2 million for this? You just brought a live grenade into my office." Vanessa stared at this bright laptop screen. Her heart stopped beating. The air was violently sucked out of her lungs. The screen did not show any European merger strategies. It did not show any corporate valuations or bidding algorithms. The screen was filled with a meticulously compiled high-definition digital trail. The very first document was a crystal-clear scanned copy of the forged collateral loan agreement, leveraging my grandfather's lake house. At the bottom of the page, in sharp black ink, was Vanessa's unmistakable forged signature. The next document was a comprehensive bank wire trace, proving exactly how Cameron had funneled stolen client funds into an offshore shell account that was registered entirely in Vanessa's name. The screen displayed dozens of emails, text messages, and bank receipts. It was a flawless, undeniable, and absolutely damning portfolio of federal crimes. I had never stored corporate secrets on that decoy computer. I had intentionally planted that specific folder on the desktop, knowing her greedy, desperate nature would eventually drive her to break in and steal it. I knew she would try to sell whatever she found to my biggest competitor. Vanessa could not breathe. She was staring at a completely documented federal indictment of her own life. "You did not bring me corporate intellectual property," Marcus said, standing up from the table in absolute fury. "You just walked into my firm and handed me federal evidence of your own felony fraud and your husband's massive offshore embezzlement. You just handed a third party the exact weapon needed to put you in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Vanessa stared at the screen as the full weight of the trap crushed her into dust. She had just personally hand-delivered the final nails for her own coffin. The Zenith boss did exactly what any ruthless corporate executive would do when handed a live explosive device. He contacted his elite legal team, who notified federal authorities to clear Zenith Financial of any complicity. The devastating news of the security leak reached Cameron before Vanessa even made it back to her cheap motel room. Cameron was a coward, but he had a highly tuned survival instinct. When he realized his wife had hand-delivered their classified offshore records directly to a third party, he knew the corporate game was over. Federal agents would be freezing his remaining hidden assets and preparing arrest warrants by morning. He was staring directly down the barrel of a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. In his frantic mind, there was only one person powerful enough to make this terrifying nightmare disappear. He needed someone with the billions required to pay off the angry institutional investors and the elite legal influence to sweep the embezzlement charges away. He needed me. He decided in seconds to completely abandon the woman he married and throw her directly into the path of the incoming federal train. It was late Thursday evening. I had stayed at the Aegis Capital headquarters long past regular business hours, finalizing the structural details of my European merger. The executive parking garage was located 3 levels underground beneath the towering glass skyscraper. It was a massive cavernous space made of cold gray concrete and illuminated by harsh buzzing fluorescent lights. The stale air was thick with the smell of motor oil. I walked out of the private elevator, and my heels echoed sharply across the empty structure. My armored black sedan was parked 50 yards away. My private security detail usually escorted me to the vehicle, but I had explicitly dismissed them for the night, wanting absolute quiet. That was a highly calculated decision on my part. I knew Cameron was desperately tracking my movements. My cybersecurity team had detected an amateur attempt to ping my personal cell phone location earlier that afternoon. I wanted to give him the perfect opportunity to corner me. I wanted to see exactly how low he was willing to sink when the pressure became unbearable. As I calmly approached my vehicle, a dark shadow detached itself from the thick concrete pillar near the passenger side door. Cameron stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light. He looked absolutely atrocious. The custom Italian suit he wore so proudly to my boardroom just days ago was severely wrinkled and stained with sweat. His expensive silk tie was missing. His hair was completely disheveled, and he was sweating heavily despite the deep chill in the underground garage. He held his hands up in a pathetic, placating gesture, looking nervously to make sure we were completely alone in the vast space. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted for miles. "Nina, please do not call your security team," he begged, his voice cracking with unhinged panic. "I just need 5 minutes of your time. Just 5 minutes to explain everything before this gets entirely out of hand." I stood perfectly still, maintaining a safe distance between us. I did not reach into my pocket to hit the panic button. I simply watched him sweat under the flickering lights. "You have exactly 2 minutes, Cameron," I said coldly, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "And you better make them count, because federal authorities are drafting your arrest warrant right now." He visibly shuddered at the mention of the authorities. He took a hesitant, shaking step forward, closing the physical distance between us. All his previous arrogant swagger was gone. He was nothing but a terrified, hollow shell of a man begging for his corporate life. "It was all Vanessa." He blurted out, the words tumbling from his mouth in a frantic, chaotic rush. "You have to believe me, Nina. I never wanted to steal that client money. I never wanted to commit corporate fraud." She completely forced my hand. She demanded that massive mansion and the luxury imported cars and the exclusive country club memberships. When my initial investments took a slight downturn, she viciously threatened to leave me and totally destroy my social reputation if I did not maintain her lavish standard of living. She made me create those illegal offshore accounts. She orchestrated the forged collateral documents on your grandfather's lake house. I was just trying to keep my marriage together. I am the true victim here, Nina. She manipulated me just like she manipulated you your entire life. The sheer audacity of his pathetic lies was breathtaking. He was actively attempting to rewrite a decade of history to save his own skin. I took another step closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper, attempting to invoke a romantic connection that died 8 years ago. "I made a terrible, monumental mistake when I left you, Nina," he said, tears welling up in his dark eyes. "I was young and stupid, and Vanessa completely blinded me with her fake high society connections. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in the last 8 years. You were always the one with the real brilliance, the real beauty. You built this massive corporate empire while I was trapped in a miserable fake marriage with a woman I despise. I see that now. I see how incredibly powerful and brilliant you are. Please, Nina, You have the absolute power and the limitless money to make these federal charges go away. You can easily pay off my angry investors. You can fix this entire mess with one phone call. Save me. We can start over. Just you and me like we always planned before she ruined everything. I will do whatever you want. I will actively testify against Vanessa in federal court. I will give the prosecutors all the direct evidence they need to lock her away in a federal prison forever if you just protect me. Please, Nina, give me a second chance. I listened to his entire pathetic, manipulative monologue in complete, absolute silence. I let him lay all his desperate cards on the table. I let him completely and thoroughly betray his wife without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. He was fully willing to send the woman he legally married to a federal penitentiary for decades just to save himself from the consequences of his own severe financial crimes. When he finally finished begging, he looked at me with wide, hopeful eyes, genuinely believing his manipulative emotional performance had actually worked. He truly thought I was still that naive, broken 25-year-old girl who would desperately swoop in to rescue him from his own mistakes. He expected me to melt into his arms and offer him the financial bailout of a lifetime. I looked at him with an expression of pure, absolute, unadulterated disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream at him for his blatant disrespect. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my tailored trench coat and pulled out my mobile phone. I did not break eye contact with him as I tapped a single specialized application on the bright glowing screen. I had ordered my building security team to wire my phone directly into the parking garage public address system before I stepped into the elevator. A piercing electronic feedback whine echoed off the concrete walls, followed instantly by the booming amplified playback of the last 3 minutes of our conversation. Cameron's treacherous voice thundered through the massive garage at maximum volume. His frantic admissions bounced violently off the concrete pillars. I never wanted to commit corporate fraud. She forced my hand. I will testify against Vanessa in federal court. I will give the prosecutors the direct evidence they need to lock her away in a federal prison forever if you just protect me. Cameron gasped in sheer horror as his own treasonous words echoed around him like a physical blow. He looked wildly at the ceiling speakers, not comprehending what was happening. I calmly locked my phone screen and slid the device back into my pocket. I raised my hand and pointed my finger directly at a thick structural pillar located exactly 20 feet behind where Cameron was standing. You should really check your surroundings before you try to sell out your wife. Cameron, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the damp air. A moment later, a figure slowly stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. It was Vanessa. She had tracked Cameron's rental car, hoping he was securing cash to flee. She had stood perfectly still in the shadows, listening as the husband she stole completely threw her under the federal bus and begged her sister for a second chance. The look of profound, soul-crushing devastation on Vanessa's face as she stared at her traitorous husband was an image I would savor for the rest of my life. The absolute destruction of a marriage playing out over a public address system in a cold concrete parking garage would be enough to break any rational human being. A normal person would have retreated into immediate hiding. They would have contacted a high-powered defense attorney and started preparing for the inevitable legal fallout. But my sister Vanessa was not a normal person. She was a hollow creature, built entirely of vanity and a fragile ego. In the face of absolute financial and marital ruin, she chose the path of aggressive theatrical denial. She believed maintaining her social standing would magically resolve everything. Her ultimate claim to high society fame was her position as the chairwoman of the prestigious Silver Horizon Charity Gala. It was an extravagant event where the elite gathered to drink champagne and pretend to care about philanthropy while networking in designer gowns. Vanessa decided that hosting this massive gala would prove to the world that she was still a wealthy, untouchable queen. She charged the luxury venue rental, the imported caviar, the open bar, and the elaborate floral arrangements directly to my parents' corporate accounts. She was completely oblivious to the fact that federal authorities had already frozen every single asset Richard and Patricia possessed due to their highly public felony tax fraud indictment. She was effectively writing massive checks on a bank account that no longer existed. The night of the heavily anticipated gala finally arrived. Vanessa had rented out the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. She spent hours having her hair and makeup professionally done by artists she promised to pay later. She wore a custom beaded gown that she had managed to secure before her personal credit lines were entirely shut down by the banks. She stood in the massive ornate foyer of the ballroom, fully expecting the city's most powerful socialites to walk through the grand double doors and validate her existence. But the heavy doors remained firmly shut. The massive crystal chandeliers illuminated a room that was painfully and humiliatingly empty. The high society elite are incredibly perceptive when it comes to the scent of financial ruin. The vicious gossip network had already circulated the undeniable truth about Cameron corporate disgrace, my parents' highly public federal tax fraud scandal, and the sudden aggressive foreclosure of Vanessa's suburban mansion. Not a single wealthy guest wanted to be photographed standing anywhere near a rapidly sinking ship. The elite socialites simply abandoned her en masse without even bothering to send their formal regrets, leaving her entirely isolated. The empty room was not even the worst part of her night. As the clock struck 8, the hotel event manager walked into the ballroom with a severe, uncompromising expression on his face. He did not approach Vanessa with the usual fawning deference she expected from high-end hospitality staff. He marched directly up to her and firmly informed her that every single credit card she had placed on file had been aggressively declined. The bank authorizations had bounced back with severe fraud warnings attached to the frozen accounts. The manager immediately signaled the event staff. The catering team abruptly stopped plating the expensive appetizers and cleared the tables. The bartenders packed up the premium liquor and locked the portable bars. The audio-visual technicians shut down the stage lighting and cut the soft background music. The vendors simply refused to provide a single ounce of service for an event that was entirely unfunded. Vanessa was left standing alone in the middle of a massive, silent, dimly lit ballroom, surrounded by empty tables and unsympathetic hotel staff, demanding immediate cash payment for the services already rendered. That is exactly the moment I chose to make my entrance. I did not sneak into the back of the room like a spectator. I walked through the grand main double doors with absolute unbitten authority. I wore a sharp emerald green evening gown that radiated quiet, undeniable power. My presence in that room was not a coincidence. I had not come simply to gloat over her empty, pathetic party. I had come because 2 weeks prior, I had quietly orchestrated a massive financial maneuver behind the scenes. Through Aegis Capital Philanthropic Division, I had become the primary anonymous financial sponsor of the very charity Vanessa claimed to champion. I effectively owned the organization she was using to prop up her fake social identity. I walked past the bewildered hotel manager and stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. The few remaining charity board members who had shown up out of sheer professional obligation immediately turned their attention to me. They recognized me not as Vanessa's estranged sister, but as the billionaire CEO who possessed the power to single-handedly fund their entire operating budget for the next decade. I tapped the microphone. The sharp sound echoed across the vast, empty ballroom, piercing through Vanessa's state of absolute shock. I looked directly at the charity board members and the few lingering hotel staff, completely ignoring the pathetic woman standing frozen in her beaded gown. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying a tone of absolute command. "It is unfortunate that the original chairwoman of tonight's event failed to secure the basic funding required to host you all properly. However, the vital work of this charity should never suffer due to the gross financial incompetence of an individual who only uses philanthropy as a shallow vanity project. True generosity does not require an audience or a red carpet." I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the weight of my words. "On behalf of Aegis Capital, I am officially announcing a $10 million direct donation to this organization operational fund. Furthermore, I am stepping in to permanently restructure the leadership board, ensuring that this charity is never again associated with individuals currently facing federal fraud investigations." The stunned charity directors actually gasped in pure shock before breaking into immediate enthusiastic applause. My announcement completely and totally erased Vanessa's entire legacy within the organization. I had just stripped away her final shred of social relevance and exposed her financial ruin to the very board members she desperately wanted to impress. It was the ultimate breaking point. The reality of her total destruction finally shattered her fragile, delusional mind. She let out a guttural, high-pitched scream of pure, unfiltered rage. She completely abandoned any lingering pretense of high society elegance. She kicked off her expensive designer heels to run faster and charged directly towards the stage like a rabid animal. She threw herself up the short flight of stairs, her face contorted with malicious hatred. She raised her hand, forming a tight fist, fully intending to physically strike me across the face in front of the remaining witnesses. She genuinely thought she could inflict physical pain to compensate for her total emotional and financial defeat. She never even came close to landing the blow. I did not flinch or back away from her frantic, aggressive charge. I stood my ground. As she swung her fist toward my face, I raised my hand with effortless, lightning-fast precision. I caught her wrist mid-air. My grip was absolute iron, locking her arm firmly in place before she could even process that her attack had been neutralized. She struggled against my hold, gasping for breath, her eyes wild with furious desperation. But she was weak, and I was completely in control. I looked at her flushed, angry face with nothing but cold, clinical indifference. I did not yell. I did not insult her. I slowly reached into the pocket of my emerald gown with my free hand. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope bearing the official seal of the United States federal court system. I calmly forced the envelope into her trembling free hand, releasing my grip on her wrist only when her fingers reflexively closed around the thick paper. She looked down at the envelope, her chest heaving with heavy, ragged breaths. "What exactly is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking with terror. "It is a federal subpoena, Vanessa," I stated smoothly, ensuring the charity board members heard every single word. "You are officially ordered to appear in federal court to answer for your direct criminal conspiracy regarding the forged collateral loan documents on my grandfather lake house. The authorities have the digital trail you so generously tried to sell to my corporate rival. They also have Cameron-recorded confession from the parking garage, actively implicating you as the primary mastermind of the offshore embezzlement scheme. You are not just bankrupt, Vanessa. You are going directly to federal prison." I slowly turned my back on her, leaving her standing frozen on the stage, clutching the legal documents that guaranteed her incarceration. I slowly walked out of the Grand Hotel ballroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, leaving my sister completely and utterly alone in the echoing, empty silence of her own absolute ruin. The immediate aftermath of handing federal evidence directly to the local news media was absolute financial devastation for my parents. Richard and Patricia had spent their entire adult lives building a fortress of artificial wealth and elite social status. That fortress completely collapsed in a matter of days. The Internal Revenue Service does not move slowly when national television broadcasts undeniable proof of felony tax fraud. By the end of the week, federal authorities had aggressively frozen every single bank account, investment portfolio, and hidden offshore shell company attached to their names. They were completely locked out of their own money. Furthermore, the aggressive foreclosure on their sprawling country club mansion was finalized. The parent company that I secretly controlled officially seized the property. The locks were changed, and my parents were forcefully evicted by the local sheriff department. They had zero liquid cash, no credit cards, and absolutely nowhere to go. I knew their snobby high society friends would completely abandon them. In their elite circle, financial ruin was treated like a highly contagious disease. Not a single person from their prestigious country club offered them a guest bedroom or a temporary loan. They were instantly exiled. I assumed they would eventually seek refuge in a cheap roadside motel, using whatever physical cash they had managed to hide in their pockets. I severely underestimated their profound and deeply ingrained sense of entitlement. They still genuinely believed that the basic rules of society simply did not apply to them. It was late Tuesday night when my private mobile phone buzzed with a high-priority alert. The notification came directly from the elite security firm I had contracted to monitor and protect my late grandfather's estate. The beautiful lake house was now legally and entirely owned by me. The property was a pristine sanctuary, and I had installed state-of-the-art surveillance systems along the entire perimeter. I opened the encrypted application on my phone and pulled up the live high-definition video feed. My parents had driven their remaining vehicle, a heavily leased luxury sedan, that would soon be repossessed down the long gravel driveway of the lake house property. I watched through the infrared camera lens as Richard and Patricia stood in the dark. They were not attempting to break into the main house, which was protected by heavy reinforced steel doors and an advanced alarm system. Instead, they were focusing their attention on the old detached guest house situated near the edge of the property line. My grandfather had built that small guest house decades ago. It was a modest wooden structure that he used as a storage shed and a temporary workspace. I watched my father pull a heavy steel crowbar from the trunk of his car. He aggressively wedged the metal bar between the wooden doorframe and the lock of the guest house. With a violent shove, he broke the old lock, and the door swung open. My mother immediately hurried inside, dragging two large, expensive designer suitcases behind her. They were actively breaking and entering into my private property. I listened to the audio feed transmitted from the hidden exterior microphones. My father was loudly bragging to my mother. He smugly declared that they were going to invoke squatter rights and claim undeniable family privilege. He told Patricia that because the estate used to belong to his father, he still had a moral and legal right to occupy the land. He arrogantly stated that evicting family members from a residential property would require months of messy, highly public litigation. He firmly believed that I would never want to drag my corporate reputation through a prolonged, muddy legal battle over a tiny guest house. He thought he had found the perfect untouchable loophole. He was planning to live on my property, indefinitely forcing me to pay the property taxes while he lived rent-free. The head of my private security detail called me less than a minute later. He calmly informed me of the breach and asked for permission to dispatch the local police department to arrest them for trespassing and breaking and entering. I sat at my kitchen counter, looking at the live video feed of my mother, unpacking her designer clothes inside the dusty old guest house. A normal person would have immediately authorized the police dispatch. But I knew exactly how my mother operated. Patricia was a master manipulator who thrived on theatrical victimhood. If I sent uniformed police officers to drag her out of a tiny guest house in the middle of the night, she would turn it into a massive dramatic performance. She would cry hysterically for the police body cameras, claiming she was a frail, homeless elderly woman being brutally terrorized by a billionaire daughter. She would use the arrest to garner public sympathy and spin a pathetic narrative of elder abuse. I was not going to give her the satisfying dramatic performance she so desperately craved. "Stand down," I instructed my security chief, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Do not call the police. Do not engage with them. Maintain a perimeter and let them sleep there for the night. I will handle this situation personally in the morning." I ended the call and opened my laptop. I accessed the municipal property records database for the county where the lake house was located. I knew my grandfather had built that guest house himself many years ago, but I also knew he had been notoriously terrible with local bureaucratic paperwork. I quickly scanned the original property deed, zoning permits, and construction records. It took me less than 20 minutes to find exactly what I was looking for. The guest house was an entirely unpermitted structure. My grandfather had never filed the proper zoning paperwork or obtained the necessary building permits when he constructed it. Legally speaking, the guest house did not actually exist on the county grid. It was an unauthorized hazard. Furthermore, as the new legal owner of the entire estate, I had full discretionary authority to remove any unpermitted safety hazards from my land without needing to file a formal eviction notice for unwanted occupants. Squatter rights absolutely do not apply to illegal unpermitted structures that are slated for immediate hazardous demolition. I smiled. I did not call the police. Instead, I made a very different, highly specialized phone call. I contacted a private rapid response commercial demolition company that operated in the county. I offered to pay them triple their usual emergency rate if they could mobilize a full heavy machinery crew to my lake house property by 6 o'clock the following morning. The owner of the demolition company eagerly accepted the lucrative contract. The next morning, the sun was barely beginning to rise over the calm, glassy surface of the lake. A thick layer of white fog hovered just above the water, creating a serene, peaceful atmosphere. That peaceful silence was violently and abruptly shattered at exactly 6 o'clock. The ground physically shook as two massive yellow commercial excavators and a heavy-duty bulldozer rolled down the gravel driveway. The deafening roar of the heavy diesel engines echoed across the entire lake. The tracks of the massive machines crushed the gravel beneath them. The demolition crew parked the colossal equipment directly in front of the small wooden guest house. I was standing on the pristine back porch of the main house, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. I wore a sharp tailored blazer and a bright yellow hard hat provided by the demolition foreman. I held a thick stack of municipal permits securely in my other hand. The loud, aggressive roar of the heavy machinery instantly woke my parents. The front door of the unpermitted guest house flew open. Richard and Patricia stumbled out onto the small wooden porch. They were wearing expensive silk pajamas and looking around in sheer absolute terror. My mother covered her ears, trying to block out the deafening mechanical noise. My father looked wildly at the massive yellow excavators whose heavy steel buckets were raised high into the air, casting long, dark shadows directly over the small roof. My father spotted me standing calmly on the main porch. He marched forward, his face flushed with panic and sudden outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" he screamed, trying to make his voice heard over the roaring diesel engines. "You cannot do this, Nina. We are legally occupying this structure. You have to file a formal eviction notice through the county courts. We have squatter rights." I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. I walked down the steps of the main house and approached him. I handed him the thick stack of municipal paperwork. "You do not have squatter rights," Richard, I stated smoothly, my voice carrying absolute authority. "You are currently trespassing inside an illegal, unpermitted structural hazard. As the sole legal owner of this estate, I am fully complying with county zoning laws by immediately removing this dangerous, unauthorized building from my property." My mother ran forward, clutching her silk robe tightly around her shivering body. "You are going to tear down the building while we are living inside it," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. "You are a monster, Nina. We have nowhere else to go." I looked at my watch. "The demolition permits are legally active starting right now," I announced, ignoring her fake dramatic tears. "I instructed the demolition foreman to give you exactly 5 minutes to gather your designer bags and remove yourselves from the demolition zone. If you do not vacate the hazardous structure, the crew will proceed with their contracted work, and whatever belongings you leave inside will be crushed into dust." My parents stared at me, realizing I was completely serious. There were no police officers to manipulate. There were no news cameras to cry for. There was only a ruthless demolition crew waiting for my signal, and a daughter who no longer cared whether they lived or died. My father grabbed my mother's arm. They scrambled frantically back inside the small guest house. They desperately grabbed their expensive designer suitcases, shoving their clothes inside with chaotic, messy panic. They did not have time to pack neatly. They dragged their heavy luggage out the door and sprinted toward their leased vehicle just as the massive steel bucket of the primary excavator violently crashed through the roof of the guest house. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass filled the crisp morning air. I stood perfectly still, drinking my coffee and watching the heavy machinery completely obliterate the structure. My parents scrambled into their car, their faces pale with terror, and sped down the gravel driveway, fleeing into the blinding dust. They had tried to steal my sanctuary, and I had crushed their final refuge into the dirt. The federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan felt entirely different from the chaotic family living rooms and country clubs where my sister had previously staged her dramatic performances. This was a sanctuary of absolute rules and undeniable consequences. The high ceilings and dark mahogany walls projected a cold, clinical authority. I sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind the federal prosecutors, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. I was not there as a mere spectator. I was the primary victim of the collateral fraud, But more importantly, I was the architect of the financial investigation that had brought everyone into this room. Vanessa sat at the defense table. She had completely abandoned her usual flashy designer gowns and dripping diamonds. For her federal criminal trial, she had deliberately dressed to evoke pity. She wore a plain beige cardigan over a modest high-collared blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, understated ponytail, and she wore absolutely no makeup. She was desperately trying to look like a fragile, naive suburban housewife who had been completely overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Her high-priced defense attorney, an aggressive man who had likely taken the high-profile case on credit, sat beside her shuffling through legal pads. When Vanessa was called to the witness stand, she immediately launched into the exact theatrical performance I had anticipated. She gripped the edges of the wooden stand with trembling hands. As her attorney gently questioned her, she began to cry. They were not real tears, but she had spent 35 years perfecting the art of fake crying to manipulate our parents. She looked directly at the federal judge and spun a wildly fabricated narrative. She painted herself as an innocent, confused spouse who simply signed whatever financial documents her overbearing husband placed in front of her. She claimed she had absolutely no idea that Cameron was embezzling millions of dollars from his clients. She swore she had no knowledge of the forged collateral documents regarding my grandfather's lake house. But she did not stop there. Vanessa could not resist the urge to attack me. She pointed a shaking finger toward the gallery where I was sitting. She sobbed loudly, claiming that this entire federal trial was nothing more than a vicious personal vendetta. She told the judge that I was a deeply bitter, scorned woman who had spent the last 8 years obsessing over a broken engagement. She swore that I had maliciously used my immense corporate wealth to frame her simply because she had married the man I loved. She tried to convince the entire courtroom that the multi-billion-dollar CEO of Aegis Capital had orchestrated a massive federal conspiracy just to punish her sister over a high school-level breakup. I sat perfectly still. I did not react to her absurd accusations. I did not roll my eyes or shake my head. I simply watched her dig her own grave deeper and deeper with every single lie she told under oath. The federal prosecutors did not even bother to object to her theatrical rant. They simply let her exhaust herself because they knew exactly what was coming next. When the defense concluded their direct examination, the lead prosecutor stood up. He did not aggressively cross-examine Vanessa. He simply dismissed her from the stand. Then he announced his star witness. He called Cameron to the stand. The heavy wooden side doors of the courtroom opened, and Cameron was escorted in by 2 armed federal marshals. The transformation in his appearance was absolutely staggering. He was not wearing a custom Italian suit. He was wearing a drab, oversized khaki jumpsuit issued by the Federal Detention Center. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken into deep, dark hollows. The arrogant swagger of the formerly untouchable investment banker was completely gone. He shuffled toward the witness box, looking like a terrified, broken animal. Cameron had made a highly calculated decision when the federal indictment was handed down. Realizing he was facing decades in a maximum security prison for his massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, he had aggressively pursued a plea deal. To severely reduce his own sentence, he had agreed to fully cooperate with the federal authorities and testify directly against his own wife. The prosecutor approached the podium. He asked Cameron to clearly detail his involvement in the offshore embezzlement scheme and the forged collateral loan. Cameron leaned into the microphone. He did not hesitate. He completely and thoroughly threw Vanessa under the bus. He testified with brutal clinical precision. He explicitly stated that Vanessa was never a naive, uninformed housewife. He revealed that she was fiercely demanding and constantly threatened to destroy his reputation if he did not fund her lavish lifestyle. He provided exact dates and specific times. He testified that on the evening of October 14th, Vanessa had personally demanded he find a way to secure a $5 million bridge loan. He told the court that when he admitted he had no assets left to pledge, Vanessa had been the one to suggest using my grandfather's lake house. The courtroom was dead silent as Cameron detailed the forgery. He testified that Vanessa had stolen an old signature from a discarded family greeting card. He explicitly stated that he watched her practice forging my father's signature as the legal executor over 40 times on a notepad in their kitchen. He testified that she was the one who physically stamped the fraudulent collateral documents and forced him to submit them to the regional bank. Vanessa sat at the defense table, her face drained of all color. The beige cardigan suddenly looked absurd on a woman who was currently being exposed as a ruthless, calculating criminal mastermind. Her defense attorney frantically scribbled notes, his face growing increasingly red and agitated. He immediately stood up and aggressively objected, claiming Cameron was simply lying to save himself and demanding proof of these outrageous allegations. The prosecutor calmly turned to the judge. He announced that he would like to submit a new piece of evidence into the official record. A heavy, thick binder was brought forward. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. My elite corporate legal team, working in total cooperation with the federal investigators, had spent the last month tracing every single digital footprint Vanessa had ever left. The prosecutor handed copies of the binder to the judge and to Vanessa's defense attorney. He stated that the binder contained an indisputable, heavily encrypted digital paper trail. It proved definitively that the private offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands, the exact account holding the millions of dollars stolen from Cameron's clients, was not controlled by Cameron. The account was registered entirely under Vanessa's maiden name. Furthermore, the IP addresses used to authorize the massive wire transfers were directly traced to Vanessa's personal laptop and her private mobile phone. Cameron had physically stolen the money, but Vanessa had been the sole mastermind who funneled it offshore to hide it from the IRS and the creditors. The documents proved that she had actively managed the fraudulent accounts, logging in multiple times a week to check the balances. There was absolutely no way she could claim ignorance. She was the primary architect of the entire financial conspiracy. The defense attorney stared at the documents in front of him. His hands were actually shaking. In federal court, an attorney cannot knowingly allow their client to commit perjury on the witness stand. Vanessa had just spent 2 hours crying under oath, swearing she knew absolutely nothing about any offshore accounts or stolen money. The attorney realized in that exact horrifying second that his client had completely lied to him during their private consultations and had just committed blatant, irrefutable perjury in front of a federal judge. The attorney immediately stood up. His voice was tight and strained. He requested an emergency recess, stating he needed to consult privately with his client regarding the newly submitted evidence. The judge granted a strict 15-minute recess and banged the gavel. I remained in my seat as the courtroom cleared out. I watched as the defense attorney practically dragged Vanessa by her arm into a small private consultation room adjacent to the main hall. Through the thick glass pane of the door, I could see the lawyer pacing frantically, his face dark red with fury. He was pointing aggressively at the binder of evidence and shouting at Vanessa. She was backed into a corner, shaking her head and frantically waving her hands, trying to spin another web of lies. But paper trails do not lie, and federal bank records are absolute. Exactly 15 minutes later, the court was called back into session. The judge took his seat at the bench. Cameron was escorted back to the witness box by the armed marshals. The prosecutor stood ready, but Vanessa's defense attorney did not return to his seat next to her. He stood rigidly at the podium, his briefcase already packed and tightly gripped in his hand. "Your Honor," the attorney said, his voice echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. "In light of the newly submitted evidence and certain irreconcilable conflicts that have just arisen between myself and my client, I am formally requesting to immediately withdraw as defense counsel for Vanessa in this matter." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. In a federal criminal trial, a defense attorney publicly withdrawing in the middle of an active session is the ultimate death knell. It signifies to everyone in the room that the client is undeniably guilty and entirely unmanageable. Vanessa sat alone at the large defense table, the fake innocent facade completely shattered. She looked wildly around the massive wood-paneled courtroom. She looked at Cameron, who refused to meet her eyes. She looked at the judge, who was glaring down at her with severe, uncompromising authority. And finally, she turned around and looked directly at me. She was completely stranded, legally exposed, and backed into a corner she could never manipulate her way out of. I sat in the front row, maintaining absolute perfect stillness, and offered her a slow, chilling smile. The sharp crack of the federal judge, striking his heavy wooden gavel, cut cleanly through the shocked murmurs of the courtroom gallery. He sternly announced an immediate 30-minute recess, informing the defendant that she must secure new legal representation or formally accept a court-appointed public defender before the proceedings could legally continue. The judge stood up and walked into his private chambers, leaving absolute chaos in his wake. I did not stay in the courtroom to watch the aftermath. I stood up from my seat in the front row, smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal suit, and calmly walked down the center aisle. The federal prosecutors offered me brief, respectful nods of acknowledgement as I passed their table. I stepped out through the heavy double doors and into the wide, brightly lit marble corridor of the courthouse. The air outside the courtroom felt cool and crisp. I took a deep breath, savoring the undeniable taste of absolute victory. Everything I had planned had executed with flawless precision. I walked down the long, silent hallway toward the women's restroom, needing a brief moment of quiet solitude to collect my thoughts before the final ruling. The restroom was a stark contrast to the opulent country club where this entire conflict had reignited. The walls were lined with cold white subway tiles, and the harsh fluorescent lighting offered no flattering angles. I walked over to the stainless steel sink, turned on the cold water, and held my wrists under the steady stream. I looked at myself in the wide mirror. I looked exactly like the billionaire CEO I was. I possessed total control over my life and my environment. The heavy wooden door of the restroom suddenly burst open with a violent shove. The metal handle slammed hard against the tiled wall. I did not flinch or reach for the panic button on my phone. I simply looked up into the mirror. Vanessa stood in the doorway. She was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, as if she had just sprinted for miles. The transformation she had undergone over the last few weeks was staggering, but seeing it up close under the harsh bathroom lights was entirely different. The beige cardigan she had worn to evoke pity in the courtroom now just looked cheap and pathetic. Her hair had escaped its neat ponytail, hanging in stringy, unkempt strands around her pale face. The absolute terror radiating from her eyes was completely genuine. She was a woman staring directly into the abyss of a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. She quickly shoved the heavy door closed behind her and locked the deadbolt, ensuring we were completely alone. She did not march up to me with her usual arrogant swagger. She practically stumbled forward, her legs shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. "Nina," she gasped, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "You have to stop this. You have to call off your legal team. Please, Nina. They are going to lock me in a federal cell for 20 years. I will not survive in there. You know I cannot survive in a place like that." I reached out and pressed the metal dispenser, gathering a small pool of liquid soap into my palms. I slowly began to wash my hands, completely ignoring her frantic begging. I methodically worked the soap between my fingers, maintaining my calm, clinical demeanor. "I am not the one prosecuting you, Vanessa," I stated evenly, my voice echoing slightly off the cold tiled walls. "The federal government is prosecuting you for felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I simply handed them the digital receipts you so generously tried to sell to my corporate rival. You built your own prison. I just handed the guards the keys." Vanessa let out a guttural, sobbing cry. The last remaining shred of her fake high society facade completely evaporated. She did not try to deny her crimes. She did not try to blame Cameron or our parents or claim she was a naive victim. The sheer terror of her impending incarceration finally broke the dam she had maintained for her entire life. She collapsed against the row of bathroom sinks, gripping the cold porcelain to keep herself from falling to the floor. "I lied," she sobbed hysterically, her shoulders heaving with the force of her confession. "I lied about everything, Nina. I knew exactly what Cameron was doing. I forced him to do it because I was completely terrified of losing my status. But you have to understand why I did it. You have to understand why I took him from you in the first place." I turned the faucet back on and rinsed the soap from my hands, watching the bubbles circle the drain. I remained entirely silent, giving her the empty space to hang herself with her own words. "I was so incredibly jealous of you," Vanessa cried out, the raw, ugly truth finally spilling from her lips. "Since we were teenagers, I was terrified of you. Mom and Dad always praised my looks. They told me my beauty was my greatest asset and that I was destined for high society. But I knew the truth, Nina. I always knew I was completely empty inside. I had no actual skills. I had no drive. I had absolutely nothing to offer the world except a pretty face and a fake smile. And I knew that looks inevitably fade. She took a shaky breath, wiping a stream of tears from her pale cheeks. But you, she continued, her voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. You had this raw, terrifying intelligence. You possessed this relentless, unbreakable drive. While I was busy agonizing over prom dresses and country club invitations, you were reading financial reports and teaching yourself advanced data analytics. I would watch you studying at the kitchen table, and I felt this paralyzing fear because I knew you were going to build an empire. I knew that eventually you were going to completely eclipse me. I knew that one day the world would see exactly how brilliant you were, and they would realize I was nothing but a useless prop. She practically threw herself toward me, closing the distance between us. She grabbed the edge of my sink, her knuckles turning white. When Cameron proposed to you, it broke me, Vanessa admitted, tears streaming freely down her face. He was so incredibly ambitious. He was handsome and driven, and he looked at you with this profound awe. He looked at you like you were the most powerful woman in the world. I could not handle it, Nina. I could not stand the thought of you having the brilliant career and the perfect, successful husband while I sat around waiting for my looks to fade. I had to take him from you. I had to prove to myself that I was still the superior sister. I seduced him simply because it was the only way I could feel powerful. I stole your future because I knew I did not have one of my own. The absolute pathetic nature of her confession hung heavily in the damp air of the restroom. She had destroyed our family bond, shattered a marriage, and committed federal felonies, all because she was deeply insecure about her own profound lack of substance. She had spent a decade desperately trying to outrun her own mediocrity, and it had led her directly to a federal courthouse. Please, Nina, she begged, her legs finally giving out. She dropped to her knees on the cold, hard bathroom tiles, ruining her beige cardigan. She clasped her hands together, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I am begging you. I am on my knees begging for my life. You have billions of dollars. You have limitless corporate influence. You know the federal prosecutors. You can talk to them. You can tell them to drop the charges or offer me a deferred prosecution agreement. I will do absolutely anything you want. I will sign away any remaining claim to the family estate. I will publicly apologize. I will disappear, and you will never have to look at my face again. Please remember that we are sisters. Remember the bond we used to share when we were little girls. Do not let them lock me away in a cage. I reached over to the wall-mounted paper towel dispenser. I pulled out a single rough brown sheet. I slowly and methodically dried my hands, patting the moisture from my skin with deliberate care. I tossed the crumpled paper towel into the silver trash bin. I finally turned away from the sink and looked down at the pathetic, sobbing woman kneeling on the floor. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel the slightest twinge of sisterly compassion. The bond she was desperately trying to invoke had been severed 8 years ago when she stood at an altar and proudly married the man she stole from me. I looked her dead in the eye through the reflection of the wide bathroom mirror. My voice was incredibly smooth, completely devoid of any anger or malice. You think you won a grand prize 8 years ago, Vanessa, I said calmly. You thought stealing my fiancé was the ultimate victory that would secure your place in high society. But you were always too blinded by your own vanity to see the actual truth. She stared up at me, her breath hitching in her throat. I knew Cameron was weak. I continued, my words slicing through the air like a scalpel. I saw the early signs of his ethical flexibility long before you ever seduced him. I knew his ambition far outweighed his actual talent, and I knew he would eventually cross a line to get what he wanted. When you actively conspired to steal him from me, you did not ruin my future. You actually saved it. You removed a massive financial and emotional liability from my life, leaving me completely free to build Aegis Capital without a weak man dragging me down. I stepped closer to her, looking down at her tear-stained, terrified face. You did not win 8 years ago, Vanessa, I said smoothly, delivering the final crushing blow to her fragile ego. You just bought a sinking ship, and now you get to go down with it. I did not wait for her to respond. I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy wooden door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, stepping out into the bright marble corridor of the federal courthouse. I let the heavy door swing shut behind me, hearing it click firmly into place. The sound of her desperate sobbing was completely cut off, leaving me in the quiet, peaceful hallway, free to walk back into the empire I had built for myself. The federal government does not care about your social standing or your country club memberships when they come to collect their debts. They operate with a cold, mechanical efficiency that strips away all illusions of grandeur. 1 month after the dramatic collapse of Vanessa's federal trial, the final remaining assets of Richard and Patricia were forcefully liquidated. The Internal Revenue Service had seized everything they owned to cover the massive penalties incurred by their years of deliberate corporate tax fraud. The venue for this final dismantling was not a glamorous auction house with champagne and crystal chandeliers. It was a bleak, highly fluorescent lit municipal building in the center of the county. The walls were painted a depressing shade of institutional beige, and the chairs were hard-molded plastic. I arrived exactly 10 minutes before the public auction began. I wore a tailored black trench coat over a simple dark turtleneck, blending seamlessly into the shadows at the very back of the crowded room. The room was packed with local bargain hunters, estate liquidators, and curious onlookers who had followed the massive public scandal on the local news. They were all eager to pick the meat off the bones of a fallen high society family. I stood perfectly still near the heavy metal exit doors, watching the scene unfold with absolute emotional detachment. My parents were seated in the very front row. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The arrogant, polished couple who had tried to extort me for $5 million in their sprawling mansion just weeks ago had completely vanished. Richard wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Patricia sat beside him, wrapped in a basic department store sweater, her posture slumped and defeated. They were being forced to endure the ultimate humiliation. They had to sit there in public and watch every single symbol of their fake elite status auctioned off to strangers for absolute pennies on the dollar. The municipal auctioneer stepped up to the podium and tapped his microphone. He did not care about the sentimental value or the designer brands of the items he was selling. He moved through the lots with a rapid, monotonous voice, treating their prized possessions like discarded junk. I watched as my father's customized imported sports cars vehicles he used to flaunt his supposed wealth at the country club were sold off in less than 60 seconds to a used car dealer from the suburbs. I watched my mother's extensive collection of original oil paintings, pieces she had bragged about during her lavish dinner parties, auctioned off for a fraction of their appraised value to a local hotel liquidator. With every strike of the auctioneer's wooden gavel, my parents visibly flinched. They were watching their entire identity being systematically erased. Their absolute obsession with material wealth was finally destroying them from the inside out. They had valued objects and status over the well-being of their own daughter, and now those very objects were being boxed up and carried away by strangers in cheap denim jeans. As a set of my mother's custom antique silver serving trays was brought to the presentation table, Patricia suddenly turned around in her plastic chair. She scanned the crowded room, her eyes wide and frantic as if searching for a miracle to save her from this public nightmare. Her desperate gaze cut through the crowd and landed directly on me, standing quietly in the shadows at the back of the room. I did not break eye contact. I did not offer her a comforting smile or a nod of sympathy. I simply looked at her with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate executive observing a finalized bankruptcy. The sudden realization that the billionaire daughter she had actively tried to destroy was silently watching her ultimate downfall completely broke her. Patricia stood up from her chair, her hands trembling violently. She ignored my father, who tried to pull her back down. She pushed her way through the crowded rows of plastic chairs, ignoring the annoyed grumbles of the bargain hunters. She practically stumbled toward the back of the room, her face pale and streaked with tears. She stopped just a few feet away from me. She looked absolutely pathetic. The woman who had proudly called me a useless data clerk and demanded I empty my savings to fund her favorite daughter's fraudulent lifestyle was now completely shattered. "Nina," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw, desperate panic. "Please, you have to stop this. They are taking everything. They just sold the dining table where we celebrated your high school graduation. They are selling our entire lives to these horrible people. I kept my hands buried deep in the pockets of my trench coat. You sold your own lives, Patricia, I stated evenly. You chose to commit federal tax fraud to fund a fake lifestyle. You chose to leverage my grandfather's estate to protect a criminal. The federal government is simply balancing your ledger. I have absolutely nothing to do with this auction. She let out a strangled, sobbing gasp. I know, she cried, reaching out as if to touch my arm but stopping herself when I took a deliberate step back. I know we made terrible mistakes. We were blind and greedy, and we treated you horribly. I am so incredibly sorry for everything we did to you. But please, Nina, I am begging you. You have more money than God. You could buy this entire auction house and not even notice the expense. You do not have to save everything. Just save one thing, please. She pointed a shaking finger toward the front of the room, where the auction staff were rolling out a locked glass display case. The case contained the family's seized jewelry collection. My wedding ring! She sobbed, her chest heaving with desperate breaths. It is a family heirloom. It belonged to your great-grandmother. It has been in this family for 4 generations. It is the only real thing I have left in this world. They are going to sell it in the next lot. Please, Nina. I know you hate me, but do not let a piece of our family history go to a stranger. Buy it back. Keep it in the family. I am begging you on my knees to save that ring. I looked at her tear-stained face. She was completely stripped of her pride, resorting to begging the daughter she had disowned for a simple scrap of metal and carbon. I looked past her to the front of the room where the auctioneer was unlocking the glass case. He pulled out the heavy velvet box containing the 3-carat flawless diamond heirloom ring. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry, an undeniable symbol of the deep generational wealth my family had completely squandered. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. We now move to lot 47, he announced, his voice echoing off the beige walls. A platinum vintage estate ring featuring a flawless 3-carat center diamond. We will open the bidding at $10,000. A local jeweler in the 3rd row immediately raised his bright yellow paddle. 10,000, the auctioneer confirmed. Do I have 12? A pawnshop owner near the aisle raised his hand. 12,000, we have 12,000. Patricia looked at me, her eyes wide with frantic, desperate hope. Please, Nina, she whispered, her voice breaking. Please. I pulled my hands out of my coat pockets. I slowly stepped forward, moving past my sobbing mother and stepping into the clear line of sight of the auctioneer. I did not grab a yellow bidding paddle. I simply raised my right hand high into the air, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. $50,000! I announced, my voice cutting sharply through the murmurs of the crowded room. The entire room went dead silent. The local jeweler and the pawnshop owner slowly lowered their paddles, turning around to stare at the woman in the designer trench coat who had just aggressively obliterated the bidding war. $50,000 was a massive premium, far above the wholesale liquidation value of the ring. It was an absolute, undisputed knockout bid. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a massive jump. I have $50,000 from the lady in the back, he said, his voice laced with sudden excitement. Do I have 55? Going once, going twice. He slammed the heavy wooden gavel down hard onto the podium. Sold for $50,000. A massive wave of profound relief instantly washed over Patricia's face. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Fresh tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of absolute joy and perceived salvation. She turned to me, her eyes shining with intense gratitude. She genuinely believed that in the final crucial moment, the unbreakable bond of family loyalty had prevailed. She thought her desperate emotional plea had actually worked, and that I had stepped in to rescue her most prized possession. Oh, thank you, Nina, she cried out, taking a step toward me. Thank you so much. I knew you still cared. I knew you would not let our family legacy be destroyed. You have no idea what this means to me. I promise I will make this up to you. I completely ignored her. I walked forward down the center aisle, ignoring the stares of the curious crowd. I approached the clerk's table at the front of the room. I handed the administrative assistant my Obsidian corporate card. She processed the massive $50,000 transaction in seconds and handed me the heavy velvet box containing the heirloom diamond ring. I securely snapped the velvet box shut and turned around holding the ring in my right hand. Patricia was waiting for me at the back of the center aisle. She was smiling through her tears, holding both of her hands out toward me, palms facing upward, ready to receive the precious family heirloom. She looked exactly like a starving dog waiting for a scrap of meat to be dropped into her open mouth. I walked steadily up the aisle, closing the distance between us. Patricia leaned forward, her hands trembling with eager anticipation. "You saved it," she whispered. Her eyes locked onto the black velvet box in my hand. "You actually saved it." I did not slow my pace. I did not stop walking. As I reached the exact spot where she stood with her hands outstretched, waiting for her salvation, I simply kept moving. I walked right past her outstretched hands, completely ignoring her presence as if she were nothing more than a ghost. Patricia gasped, spinning around to follow me. "Nina," she called out, her voice laced with sudden rising panic. "Where are you going?" I pushed through the heavy metal exit doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The county municipal building shared a large public plaza with several other local government offices. Right next to the main concrete stairs sat a large bright blue metal donation bin. The faded white lettering on the side of the metal box indicated it was a secure drop-off point for a local charity that provided housing and resources for victims of severe domestic violence and financial abuse. Patricia stumbled out of the heavy metal doors just in time to see me approach the bright blue bin. She froze at the top of the concrete stairs, her eyes widening in absolute unadulterated horror as she realized exactly what I was about to do. "Nina, no," she screamed, lunging forward and stumbling down the concrete steps. "Please, no. That is our family. That is my ring." I stood in front of the metal charity bin. I looked at the black velvet box in my hand containing $50,000 of squandered family history. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation or regret. I looked back at Patricia, who was scrambling desperately across the pavement, her hands reaching out in a futile, pathetic attempt to stop me. I pulled open the heavy metal chute of the donation bin. I dropped the velvet box inside. I let go of the metal handle and the heavy chute slammed shut with a loud, echoing metallic clang. The ring dropped deep into the secure vault, completely irretrievable to anyone without a specialized charity key. Patricia fell to her knees on the hard concrete pavement, staring at the blue metal box in total soul-crushing devastation. She let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure defeat. I looked down at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely worthless. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt nothing but cold, absolute freedom. I turned my back on her and walked toward my waiting car, permanently severing the final emotional tie to the toxic bloodline that had tried to destroy me. 1 year later, the bitter reality of modern American justice had completely settled into place for those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Cameron was serving a mandatory sentence in a minimum security federal facility in upstate New York, far away from any corner offices or high society galas. Vanessa was working a minimum wage shift at a 24-hour retail warehouse across town, having her weekly paycheck systematically garnished by federal courts to pay off her massive court-ordered restitution. Meanwhile, Richard and Patricia were crammed into a tiny, outdated one-bedroom rental on the far outskirts of the city, living on a strict, frozen fixed income while being entirely forgotten by the elite social circle they had spent decades trying to impress. Their grand names, once whispered with reverence at country club galas, were now nothing more than a cautionary footnote in local financial journals. The scene transitions quietly away from the cold asphalt of the city to the beautifully restored grandfather's lake house, nestled deep in the New England countryside. The property, once held hostage by legal threats and forged documents, was no longer a bargaining chip or a symbol of toxic family control. It had been meticulously transformed into a state-of-the-art sanctuary for innovation and healing. The old wooden beams had been reinforced, the wraparound porch rebuilt with native timber, and the sprawling gardens restored to vibrant life. The air smelled of fresh pine, damp earth, and clean lake water, free from the heavy, suffocating tension that had poisoned it for years. On a bright autumn afternoon, Nina stood on the sun-drenched veranda, hosting an elite, highly anticipated summit at the estate for young, underfunded female entrepreneurs. She was completely surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant peers, dedicated mentors, and sharp-minded corporate colleagues who respected her solely for her unmatched intellect, her relentless drive, and her visionary leadership, rather than demanding her compliance or blind obedience. They laughed and shared strategic business plans over coffee, treating one another as equals in a collaborative ecosystem built entirely on mutual respect and genuine support. Nina looked out across the shimmering expanse of the lake, watching the wind ripple across the water's surface as colorful leaves drifted gently from the trees. She realized with profound clarity that the ultimate satisfaction of her journey didn't come from actively orchestrating the destruction of her toxic family. True peace came from simply stepping back and allowing them to self-destruct under the immense weight of the very greed they had worshipped their entire lives. She had calmly walked away from a broken manipulative bloodline and methodically constructed an empire of her own design, living out the exact independent high-achieving life they had always foolishly thought she was far too basic to ever achieve.